The morning began quietly, too quietly for a war this close. Frost lay thick across the fields west of Aachen. In the half-light before dawn, the crews of a German 88mm flak battery worked in silence. Their breath steamed as they loaded ammunition racks, checked elevation gears, and scanned the far tree line for the gray shapes of Allied armor. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. The men had fought here for weeks, trading shells with American artillery beyond the horizon. They had learned the rhythm, the distant boom, the whine overhead, then the seconds of silence before impact. Every barrage came in waves, every wave with warning. It was a deadly pattern, but a predictable one. At 0741, a sentry shouted. He'd heard nothing, seen nothing, but something felt wrong. Then, without a single incoming whistle, the world collapsed. Dozens of shells struck the position simultaneously, erupting in perfect unison. The ground buckled. The sky turned white. Range tables, trucks, men, all vanished in an instant. There was no rhythm this time, no pause between salvos. It was as if time itself had broken. For the survivors staggering through the smoke, the realization came slowly, impossibly. This wasn't luck. This was calculation. They had just been hit by something new, an American artillery technique called time on target, where every gun within miles fired so precisely that its shells arrived together. To those who witnessed it, the attack felt less like a bombardment and more like execution by mathematics. Before the clock struck 0, how artillery once announced itself. For centuries, artillery had been a symphony of chaos. Cannons, howitzers, and mortars thundered one after another, each following its own rhythm, each bound by human reaction and mechanical delay. Even by the Second World War, despite radar and radios, the act of bombarding an enemy was still a temporal affair, something that unfolded over time, not all at once. In that space between the first and the last shell, men could move, breathe, and survive. The predictable storm. During the early years of World War II, the standard artillery method, used by both Axis and Allied armies, was the rolling barrage. Batteries would open fire in waves, their shells creeping forward across the battlefield in timed lifts. It was devastating, but it had a rhythm that could be read like a heartbeat. A trained German flak or infantry crew could sense when to duck, when to run, when to return to their guns. They listened for the first whistles, then the pattern that followed, heavy to light, near to far. The human ear became the best survival tool on the front. The science of ballistics had advanced, but the psychology of gunnery hadn't changed much since 1916. Spotters called corrections through field telephones. Ranges were read from printed tables. Batteries fired by stopwatch and voice command, never truly synchronized, each round following the last in a staggered procession. For defenders, that sequence mattered. It meant time. Sometimes only seconds, but seconds could mean life. A man could press himself into a trench or dive beneath the gun shield. Even as shells tore apart the landscape, the pattern gave the illusion of control. The German art of survival. German anti-aircraft and field gun crews were among the most disciplined soldiers of the war. They lived in a world of mathematics and reflexes, knowing that survival often depended on how quickly they could return to readiness after a barrage. When the Allies opened fire, crews counted the seconds between detonations. If 10 guns were firing, there would be rhythm, a pulse. The air would split in sequence. 1, 2, 3. Even under bombardment, a man could sense the beats between impacts. In the flak batteries around Aachen and the Siegfried Line, that rhythm became ritual. When shells fell close, gunners stayed low. When the pauses lengthened, they ran to reload, re-aim, re-engage. Over time, they came to trust that instinct, but war, especially American war, was about to remove instinct from the equation. The American obsession with precision across the channel. In the offices of the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a new generation of officers was rethinking what a barrage could be. They no longer wanted artillery to behave like a storm rolling across the battlefield, noisy, powerful, but predictable. They wanted it to strike like a hammer all at once, with no warning, no rhythm, and no escape. The challenge wasn't power. The U.S. already had the best guns and ammunition in the world. It was timing. Each gun fired from a different position, often miles apart. Even if they aimed at the same target, shells reached it at different times because of variations in distance, barrel wear, and powder charge. Synchronizing those trajectories to arrive together seemed impossible. But in 1942, a young artillery officer named Brigadier General Carlos Brewer, along with mathematician Colonel William Ruggles, began working on a method to solve that exact problem. Their idea was simple in theory but revolutionary in effect. If each gun crew fired not when ordered, but when mathematically calculated, the rounds would arrive simultaneously, as if the sky itself had fired them. They called it time on target, or simply TUT. The mathematics of murder. The technique demanded precision. Before firing, every battery calculated the time of flight for its shells, how many seconds it would take for a round to travel from the muzzle to the target. Each gun's flight time was slightly different depending on range, elevation, and charge. If Battery A's shells took 30 seconds to reach the target, and Battery B's took 45, then Battery B would fire 15 seconds earlier. Every firing crew synchronized its watch to the second, using a radio signal broadcast from division headquarters. Then, at the exact moment predetermined by mathematics, all batteries fired. The shells, despite leaving their barrels miles apart, struck their target within a 2-second window. For the men beneath that strike, there was no warning. The first explosion was also the last. The sound of the guns themselves came afterward, the distant echo of a decision already made. The first tests in 1943 shocked even the Americans. Observation posts reported entire mock positions erased in the first few seconds, with no survivors to seek cover. What had once taken minutes of sustained fire could now be achieved in half a minute. It was timing as a weapon. War measured in milliseconds. Early lessons. Time on target first saw combat in Tunisia, where U.S. artillery officers used it to shatter German strongpoints outside Kasserine. At first, even their own infantry didn't understand what had happened. Men on the ground described hearing a single long crack of thunder, not a barrage but an instant transformation of landscape. In Italy, the method became refined. By Normandy, it was doctrine. Each corps-level artillery network had the training, radio discipline, and computational skill to coordinate dozens of batteries over vast distances. By the time of the push into France, American gunners could deliver hundreds of shells onto a point target with less than a 5-second spread. To the Germans, it was uncanny. The sound of a time-on-target barrage wasn't like normal shelling. There was no buildup, no pattern. It simply arrived. By the winter of 1944, near Aachen, flak crews were about to face its perfected form, the moment artillery learned to think together. By 1944, the American Army had transformed artillery from a supporting branch into its own kind of intelligence system, a network of mathematics, radio, and discipline that thought faster than any human could react. Where the Germans saw chaos in war, the Americans saw geometry. The radio revolution. The secret lay not in the guns themselves, but in the radios that linked them. Every artillery battalion from Normandy onward carried a dedicated signal section, men trained to operate crystal-controlled transmitters that synchronized watches down to the second. Before an operation, the division's Fire Direction Center broadcast a single time check. Stand by. Time will be 0730 seconds. Mark. Across France, hundreds of men adjusted their wristwatches at that signal. Every battery, every forward observer, every fire direction officer shared the same heartbeat. That was the foundation of time on target. With synchronized time, the rest was mathematics. Using slide rules and range tables, fire direction officers calculated the precise time of flight for each gun, depending on distance, elevation, and ammunition type. If a 105mm battery's shells took 33.6 seconds to travel, and a 155mm howitzer's rounds took 41.2 seconds, the heavier guns simply fired 7.6 seconds earlier. The first shell to leave any barrel would be the first to arrive. The last to fire would arrive with it. From above, the effect looked impossible. Rings of explosions expanding outward in perfect simultaneity, as if the battlefield had been struck by lightning rather than shells. At the heart of each artillery network was a tent or truck packed with maps, telephones, and men with pencils. This was the Fire Direction Center, FDC, the brain of the operation. Its officers translated target coordinates from observers into firing data for multiple batteries. When a division prepared for a TOT strike, these men became human computers, plotting angles, wind corrections, and fuse settings faster than any machine could. Each FDC kept graphical firing tables, long sheets marked with elevation and time of flight curves. A single call from a forward observer could trigger 20 guns across 3 battalions, all adjusted for distance and elevation, all aimed to land within seconds of one another. By late 1944, a veteran FDC could plan and execute a TOT mission in under 5 minutes. It was a choreography of precision. Observers on the front line spotted the target, FDCs, translated those coordinates into firing. Data, batteries received firing orders with calculated time delays. All guns fired, so that every shell reached the target at the same instant. For the soldiers on the receiving end, it felt like the sky had turned against them. Field test. France. 1944, the system reached perfection in France. During the breakout from Normandy, U.S. artillery was tasked with neutralizing entrenched German flak and anti-tank positions blocking Allied armor near Saint-Lô. Conventional barrages had failed. The Germans simply went underground and recrewed between waves. Then, for the first time in Europe, the U.S. 19th Corps employed full-scale time-on-target coordination across 72 guns. Observers marked the German batteries with smoke. Firing data went out by radio, watches synchronized, charges checked. At 08 and 32, read, every gun fired. At 08, 32, 42, every shell arrived. There was no crescendo, no warning. A single flash of white light erupted across the German ridge, followed by one long roll of thunder. The entire position, trenches, vehicles, and communications lines, ceased to exist in less than a minute. Later, reconnaissance photos showed no shell pattern, only a flat patch of earth. It was a demonstration of what American gunners now called mathematical shock, the human reaction to Allied infantry. TOT was awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Soldiers advancing through the wreckage after one of these strikes described fields so perfectly cratered they looked mowed by explosions. Foxholes had simply disappeared. Men who had fought under every kind of shell fire said time on target felt unnatural, as if the world had been edited out of existence and replaced by smoke. To the Germans, it was something else entirely, a psychological weapon. Those who survived a TOT strike spoke of total disorientation. Because all shells landed at once, there was no sound of approach, no screaming descent, no rising fear. The first noise they heard was the detonation itself. Many thought they had been hit by aircraft or mines rather than artillery. German reports from Normandy to the Ardennes began using the same phrase, Feuer ohne Vorwarnung, fire without warning. The phrase soon spread through entire divisions. By the time the Americans reached the Siegfried Line, German batteries were instructing new crews to expect the sky to fall at once. The flak front by late 1944, German anti-aircraft and anti-tank units had become a prime target for American artillery. Their 88mm guns, once the terror of Allied armor, had revealed a fatal flaw. They were static. Most were dug in, tethered to generators and ammunition bunkers. They could not move fast enough to survive time on target. In the battles around Aachen, Hürtgen Forest, and later the Ardennes, entire flak positions were annihilated in seconds. American forward observers, often perched on church steeples or hilltops, would radio coordinates of muzzle flashes or supply trucks. Within minutes, synchronized fire from miles away would erase them. Survivors began describing it as the American God Strike. The term wasn't metaphor. For those on the ground, it felt divine, impersonal, instantaneous, and unstoppable. A new kind of warfare. By the winter of 1944, the U.S. Army's artillery had become a weapon not of shells, but of timing. The idea was so advanced that even German intelligence struggled to understand it. Captured documents showed bewilderment. Enemy artillery appears coordinated by unseen network. All calibers land together, no interval possible for movement or recovery. They were witnessing the birth of networked warfare, the precursor to modern digital fire control. Men, maps, and radios had fused into one system that thought in seconds, acted in harmony, and struck with mechanical precision. By the time the first snow fell over the Siegfried Line, the German defenders had lost their last advantage, the rhythm of battle. Because now, the Americans didn't just fire guns, they fired time itself, the human face of instant destruction. For the men of Germany's flak regiments, the winter of 1944 was a season of exhaustion. They had spent years training to fight aircraft, to read the rhythm of the sky, to follow targets by sound and pattern. But now, the danger no longer came from above. It came from every direction at once. In the forests near Aachen and along the Siegfried Line, their guns pointed upward, their eyes trained on clouds, and then, without warning, the ground around them exploded. To the survivors, it felt as though the world had skipped a second, the interval between living and being buried. Life inside a battery. A typical German 88mm flak position consisted of 4 guns arranged in a rough square, connected by cables to a central director that calculated elevation and azimuth. Each gun had a crew of 10. Around them were trucks, ammunition racks, and the thick smell of cordite and diesel fuel. Most of these positions were dug into shallow revetments ringed with sandbags. The men slept in holes beside their guns, helmets within reach, boots never off. When shelling came, they dove under the carriages or into narrow trenches they'd carved between the guns. It wasn't much, but it was habit, a ritual born from experience. They had learned to recognize Allied barrages by sound, the distant rumble of American 105s, the sharper pop of British 25-pounders, the heavy sigh of 150mm shells. Each had a rhythm. One man in the crew usually counted the seconds between impacts, warning others when to brace. 5 seconds, he'd shout, and they'd hold their breath until the next crash. That rhythm was life itself. Until time on target arrived. The first men to face a true TOT barrage described it not as sound, but as absence. There was no whine of approach, no crescendo of terror, just a sudden wall of pressure and light. One instant the air was still. The next it was full of shrapnel and dust. Gun Captain Otto Wirth, whose battery was hit near Hürtgen in November 1944, later told an American interrogator, "I did not hear the shells come. I only felt the air being pulled away. When I stood up, my gun was gone." He had survived because he was leaning over a fuse box when the first round struck. Half his crew never moved again. Wirth's hearing never returned fully. He said the blast felt like the air itself had turned solid. Soldiers in nearby positions thought they'd been struck by aerial bombs. Others believed their ammunition had exploded. The idea that artillery could do this on its own seemed impossible. The physics of panic. In an ordinary barrage, men could read the shelling. They could count the seconds between the first and last rounds, feel the pattern shift. Their bodies learned to anticipate impact, flinching just before it came. With time on target, there was no such adaptation. All shells struck within seconds, generating overpressure that stunned even those untouched by fragments. Eyewitnesses described soldiers frozen mid-motion, men caught half-standing, knocked over not by shrapnel but by the sheer concussion of air collapsing. Others were blinded by dirt, disoriented, unable to tell which direction the attack came from. The human brain, trained to process sequences, simply could not comprehend simultaneity. Psychiatrists after the war noted that survivors of TOT strikes often displayed symptoms similar to those of high-altitude bombing raids: trembling, disassociation, time loss. Many could not remember the moments between the first explosion and the silence that followed. One American observer compared it to a camera shutter snapping on the entire position. In less than 30 seconds, everything visible had changed. Trees reduced to splinters, trucks overturned, men scattered as if by an invisible hand. The survivors' silence. Those who lived through a time-on-target bombardment rarely spoke afterward. Among German units, superstition replaced explanation. Some claimed the Americans used new fuses that detonated underground, others that sound waves triggered simultaneous explosions. The concept of perfect timing seemed too unnatural, too deliberate to believe. Flak gunner Karl Meissner recalled, "When the first one fell, all fell. It was as if they had been waiting for our breath to stop. No man shouted orders. There was no time." Crews who survived one TOT strike often refused to rebuild their positions in the same spot. They dug their next emplacements farther apart or moved at night, hoping distance would help. It didn't. American forward observers would mark new coordinates by dawn, and the process would repeat. 30 seconds of thunder, then silence. Fear without warning. Every veteran of that front described the same transformation. Fear replaced by paralysis. Ordinary shellfire provoked instinct. Duck, cover, count, wait. Time on target eliminated instinct. There was nothing to react to. Fear became static, a constant hum in the nerves, a sense that the world could end between heartbeats. German medical officers began reporting new cases of shell shock without warning. Soldiers shaken but uninjured, unable to speak for hours. Commanders noticed batteries abandoning guns after single barrages, not from cowardice but from disbelief. It was as if, one officer wrote, our men no longer trusted time. The battlefield had changed from something rhythmic and survivable into something instantaneous, mathematical annihilation. The final sensation. Those who saw it from the outside said that a time-on-target strike looked almost beautiful. An entire landscape would flash once, bright white against gray sky, and then settle into smoke and stillness. Birds fled in silence. Snow fell again within minutes. Nothing moved. For the men inside, that beauty was terror. There was no start, no middle, no end. Only a single moment when everything that existed was struck at once. And for the German flak crews who had spent their lives trusting rhythm and reflex, that moment marked the death of both. The machinery of precision. How the Americans learned to command time. The German soldiers who endured those sudden barrages never saw the true weapon that destroyed them. It wasn't a shell or a gun. It was a system, an invisible network of men, radios, mathematics, and discipline spread across miles of countryside, all bound by one idea, that if you could control when shells landed, you no longer needed to control how many. Behind every time-on-target strike, there was orchestration. A symphony of calculations conducted in silence. The eyes in the frontet began with the forward observers, the eyes of the artillery. They were usually junior officers, positioned, dangerously close to enemy lines, sometimes on church steeples, sometimes crouched in tree lines or even hidden in shell craters. They carried binoculars, compasses, and a radio set that weighed more than a rifle. Their world was geometry. Using map grids and azimuth bearings, they translated what they saw. A gun flash, a truck column, a cluster of camouflaged barrels, into coordinates. Those numbers, rattled off in a calm monotone over static-filled radio, were the seed from which destruction grew. Target, grid 112984. Flak battery, 4 guns. Request, time on target. That single transmission triggered a chain reaction, stretching back through miles of communications wire and command posts. Within minutes, the request reached the Fire Direction Center, where map clerks pinned markers, range officers checked data, and time-of-flight tables began sliding across desks like cards in a casino. The mathematics of coordination. A time on target. Mission demanded precision so fine it bordered on art. The artillerymen had to compute 3 separate values for every gun: range, elevation, and time of flight. Each gun's trajectory differed slightly because of wear, weather, and elevation. Barrels lengthened with heat, propellant charges changed with humidity, and air density shifted with altitude. Every one of those variables affected the number of seconds it would take a shell to reach the target. The Fire Direction Center's slide rule tables were designed to compensate for all of it. Crews corrected for wind using meteorological reports from balloons launched that morning. They applied fuse-setting adjustments for altitude, ensuring airbursts detonated exactly where human bodies would be. Once all times were calculated, the FDC compared them. The gun with the longest time of flight would fire first, the one nearest the target would fire last. Each received a firing order like a conductor's sheet music. Battery A. Fire minus 43 seconds. Battery B. Fire minus 31. Battery C. Fire minus 19. Then came the voice every gunner lived by. Time will be 0800, 30 seconds. Mark. Watches were adjusted. Shells were loaded. Safety catches clicked off. At exactly 08:30, a ripple of thunder rolled through the American lines. Dozens of guns firing at once, their reports echoing through valleys and fields. The sky above Germany became a web of invisible arcs, all converging on a single point in space and time. The radios that made it possible. The network's strength lay in its communication. American artillery units had something the Germans lacked: unbroken radio command. Each battalion was equipped with SCR-188 and SCR-284 radios operating on assigned frequencies. They could coordinate not just within their unit but across divisions, corps, and even army groups. Messages that once took 10 minutes to relay by telephone now traveled in seconds. The synchronization of time was maintained by radio too. Each morning, every artillery watch in the European theater synchronized to the BBC's broadcast time signal, accurate to within half a second. That accuracy was passed down from Corps headquarters to the smallest field battery. When the orders came, hundreds of men across dozens of miles were literally on the same second. It was this unity, this invisible discipline, that turned scattered gun crews into a single, global instrument. The American philosophy of fire. The Germans relied on counter-battery fire. For every shell that hit them, they answered with 10. The Americans believed in something more efficient: fire control as intelligence. Instead of brute volume, they used data. If you could make 30 guns hit 1 square of Earth within 3 seconds, you didn't need the 100 that would have taken 3 minutes. That doctrine came from Brigadier General Carlos Brewer and his staff at Fort Sill. They taught that. Firepower wasn't about how many shells you fired, but how well you arranged time. Their graduates, men like Major General Jacob Devers and General Omar Bradley, carried that philosophy into Europe, training every division's artillery to think as one organism. TOT became the physical expression of that idea. It wasn't emotion. It was mathematics. It was the sound of hundreds of clocks striking the same second. The Wehrmacht's artillery schools were brilliant, but their doctrine remained bound to line-of-sight observation and fixed command posts. Their guns were accurate, their crews brave, but their communications were rigid. They depended on telephone lines easily cut by shell fire, and when those lines broke, their coordination broke with them. They could never match the Americans' radio-based flexibility, nor their decentralized decision-making. An American observer could order a time-on-target strike within minutes of spotting a target, A German officer needed permission, confirmation, and calibration that might take half an hour. That half hour was the difference between an operational battery and a crater in the mud. By late 1944, entire German divisions began to view time on target as a kind of black magic. Reports described enemy artillery guided by unseen eye, shells arriving without sound, positions vaporized instantly. Intelligence officers struggled to explain that there was no supernatural force at work, only synchronization, discipline, and radio mathematics. The clock as a weapon. What made taut terrifying wasn't just that it killed efficiently, it killed instantly. It denied soldiers the psychological process of reacting to danger. War had always been rhythmic, an alternation of noise and silence, attack and reprieve. Time on target erased that pattern. There was no build-up, no expectation, no warning. The U.S. Army had weaponized time itself. By aligning dozens of gun crews under one clock, they had turned seconds into explosives. Each synchronized watch ticked toward destruction like a countdown shared by men who couldn't even see each other. When those watches reached zero, geography ceased to matter. What was far apart in space became one in time. And for the German soldiers crouched beside their 88s, it meant that their world, once predictable, once measured in rhythms and ranges, could vanish in the span of a heartbeat. By the winter of 1944, time on target had ceased to be an experiment. It was the new language of war, spoken in seconds, translated in fire, and understood only by those who survived it. The half-minute that changed the Western Front. Aachen, October 1944. The first German city to face the full weight of Allied firepower was already a ruin. Smoke hung between shattered rooftops. Cathedrals stood like broken ribs against a gray sky. But beneath the chaos, the most disciplined units on the German side still fought, the flak batteries and artillery regiments ringing the city like a crown of iron. Each battery had dug in along the ridgelines and crossroads east of the city. Their 88s and 105s guarded the last approaches to the Siegfried Line. For weeks, they had held off American armor and bombers with terrifying accuracy. When the U.S. First Army began its assault, those guns were the first priority on every target list, and that's when the Americans decided to use time on target on a scale never seen before. On October 10, 1944, the 68th Corps Artillery Command received an encrypted message from Division Headquarters. All counterflak positions. Simultaneous neutralization. Execute taut plan Thunder 1. Within the hour, fire direction centers across miles of forest came alive. Clerks marked maps, officers circled targets. Radio operators began calling time checks. Across a dozen hidden gun pits, watches clicked into alignment. 10 Hursi plus 20 seconds. Every man knew what that meant. Every shell from every gun would land on the same second. At the forward observation posts near Verlautenheide, American scouts adjusted binoculars toward a distant tree line. Through the morning mist, faint black, specks showed muzzle. The fire direction center took over. Distances were read, angles plotted, corrections calculated. In less than 5 minutes, the order rippled outward to more than 60 guns, 105s, 155s, and self-propelled howitzers, each receiving its firing time down to the 10th of a second. The silence before, at 09:59, the American gun lines went quiet. Men stood by their guns waiting, stopwatches in hand. The forest was still except for the faint ticking of synchronized watches. Even the distant thunder of other battles seemed to fade. At 10:30 seconds, the order came. Fire. A line of flashes lit up the horizon. Dozens of guns recoiling at once, their reports merging into a single, endless boom. Shells screamed overhead, invisible, arcing through the October sky. The gunners exhaled and reloaded, but they wouldn't hear what they had done for another 30 seconds. The impact on the German side, there was no warning. The flak battery near Fox 321 had just reloaded after shooting at a reconnaissance plane. One man was cleaning his sight. Another was eating from a tin cup. The sound that reached them wasn't incoming fire, it was the world detonating. 48 shells from multiple calibers landed within a 2-second window. The first explosion flattened the command post. The second vaporized the ammunition trailer. By the time the third hit, there was no longer a position, only soil, smoke, and silence. A forward observer watching through binoculars reported later, "The whole ridge disappeared. It was there one moment, then it wasn't. No fire sequence, no pattern, just one flash." The chain reaction. What made Thunder 1 historic wasn't just its accuracy. It was its coordination. Dozens of time-on-target missions were being executed simultaneously across the Aachen sector. Batteries struck in overlapping zones, ensuring that every German flak crew within a 10-mile radius was hit at nearly the same second. American reports described the German response as fragmentary. Counterfire ceased within minutes. Infantry patrols moving forward found trenches filled with burned cables, shattered optics, and melted gun barrels. Some positions were hit so suddenly that watchmen were still seated at their rangefinders, eyes open, unburned, killed by overpressure alone. By the afternoon, radio intercepts from German commands were panicked. Artillery without warning. All guns destroyed in first minutes. Request new firing data. Cannot re-establish communication. It was the sound of doctrine breaking apart. The new fear for decades. German soldiers had trusted their own clockwork efficiency, the precise drill of reloading, ranging, and answering back. At Aachen, that belief collapsed. Crews who once considered themselves immune to surprise found that surprise no longer required stealth. It only required synchronization. The survivors called it Höllenblitz, hell lightning. The name spread faster than the shell fire. Men began whispering that the Americans had invented a new kind of weapon, one that struck with silence. But it wasn't silence. It was timing. The precision was so complete that captured soldiers refused to believe it was done by humans. One flak gunner, interrogated later, said, "You have machines that decide the second. We cannot fight seconds." He wasn't wrong. The Americans had turned seconds into weapons. After the smoke by noon, the hills around Aachen were quiet. Engineers moved forward to clear debris, but there was little left to clear. The craters overlapped, the air still tasted of powder. In some areas, the fires burned for hours, not from fuel, but from the friction of shattered steel still glowing in oxygen. The U.S. infantry advanced with almost no resistance. A staff officer wrote in his notebook that day, "This is the first time I have seen artillery erase a position before we reach it." The barrage had lasted less than a minute. Its effect would last for generations. The forest that vanished in fire, time on target in the Hürtgen and the Ardennes. After Aachen fell, the German High Command believed the Americans would pause, regroup before pressing deeper into the Reich. They were wrong. In November 1944, the U.S. First Army entered the Hürtgen Forest, a dark labyrinth of fir trees, fog, and frozen mud along the German border. It was a place where sound itself seemed to die, where artillery was the only language that carried through the mist. And it was there that time on target reached its full, terrifying potential. The forest of steel. The Hürtgen was hell on earth. The trees were so thick that tanks couldn't maneuver and aircraft couldn't see the ground. Every ridge concealed German machine guns and anti-tank guns, and, most dangerously, flak batteries repositioned to fire horizontally down forest paths. The Americans knew conventional attacks would bleed them dry, so they turned to the one weapon that could strike without sight: mathematical artillery. Throughout November, artillery officers from the 9th Infantry Division began conducting TOT missions using aerial reconnaissance coordinates. Observers radioed data through fog and snow. FDCs plotted them with slide rules. Batteries 10 miles apart fired together, guided by nothing but synchronized watches. When the shells fell, they didn't arrive as a barrage. They materialized, hundreds of explosions erupting at once, shattering trees, burying trenches, and snapping entire trunks mid-air. The concussion was so violent that the forest itself turned into shrapnel. A German soldier from the 275th Infantry Division later described it in a post-war interview. "We thought lightning had struck every tree. It was one blow, and the forest went black." 30 seconds to oblivion, one documented mission near Wassenach. 24 U.S. batteries executed a simultaneous strike against 3 flak positions supporting a counterattack. The fire direction centers synchronized to 11:14 Su. Shells began falling at 11:14:36, all within a 2-second span. After the strike, observers reported no distinguishable targets remaining. The ground was flattened. Trees had been reduced to matchsticks. German survivors wandered dazed, uniforms shredded, bleeding from ears and eyes. The entire sequence, planning, calculation, execution, destruction, lasted 6 minutes. The flak guns had fired only once. It wasn't battle. It was elimination. 1 month later, in December 1944, the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. As their armor poured through the snowbound Ardennes, the Americans again turned to time on target, now executed at a scale no army had ever achieved. At Bastogne, when German infantry surrounded the 101st Airborne, artillery units from 3 divisions formed a single clockwork network. Forward observers inside the town relayed coordinates via encrypted SCR-300 radios. Batteries 20 miles away fired with second-by-second precision, often without direct line of sight. When the Germans massed to storm the town on December 23rd, U.S. artillery launched a coordinated TOT strike across the entire defensive line. One observer recalled, the snow lifted like a curtain. For 30 seconds there was no world. Only white fire. Survivors. In German units later described it as a storm from nowhere. Infantrymen who had marched through artillery. In Russia said they had never seen anything like it. One NCO told interrogators afterward, "You did not hear shells. You did not hear explosions. You only woke up on the ground, and it was over." The end of the flak frontier. By January 1945, German anti-aircraft and field batteries along the Western Front had ceased to function as cohesive units. Time on target had broken their structure beyond repair. Commanders tried dispersing their guns, digging deeper emplacements, and even moving positions every night. Nothing worked. The Americans didn't need to see them. Once a flash was spotted, its coordinates were enough. A few minutes later, the position would cease to exist. Captured reports from the LXX Corps near Düren summed it up bluntly. Enemy artillery appears omnipresent. No warning. No sequence. No survival. That phrase, no sequence, became the defining mark of taut success. It meant the Germans no longer perceived battle as a process, but as an instant. Time, their oldest ally, had betrayed them. The human cost, even among the Americans. There was unease. Many artillerymen described the eerie calm that followed a taut strike as worse than the firing itself. It was, one said, like erasing a heartbeat. The infantry who advanced afterward often walked through silence. The enemy wasn't retreating. He was simply gone. Positions that had resisted for days had vanished overnight, replaced by nothing but burned trees and the acrid scent of metal. At Aachen, at Hürtgen, at Bastogne, the pattern was the same. 30 seconds of thunder, then decades of quiet. By the time the Rhine was crossed in March 1945, time on target had become standard practice. Artillery officers could plan synchronized barrages in minutes. Divisions could combine fire with other corps across entire sectors. Even aircraft joined the clock, timing their bomb runs to coincide with ground shell fire. It was no longer merely a method. It was the tempo of Allied victory. The Germans never found an answer. How could they? They were fighting an enemy that had replaced chance with calculation. That turned the dimension of time into an offensive weapon. When their last flak positions fell silent in the Ruhr pocket, the few survivors described what they'd felt one last time. It came like lightning. It left nothing to bury. When the clock became a weapon system. When the guns finally fell silent over Germany in the spring of 1945, what remained was not just ruin, but revelation. The Allied armies had proven something the world had never seen before, that precision in time could be as destructive as power in numbers. For the U.S. Army's artillery, time on target had not merely been a tactic, it had been a doctrine, a revolution disguised as routine. In those last months of the war, the very nature of firepower had changed. The battlefield had become a clock. The death of static defense. Before 1944, the German way of war had always rested on one advantage: mastery of defensive engineering. They built positions meant to survive artillery, to bend but not break. Every ridge and town from Normandy to the Rhine had bunkers dug deep, camouflaged flak nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Those defenses were designed to absorb punishment, not to endure annihilation. Time on target exposed that flaw with merciless clarity. Traditional barrages, no matter how heavy, gave defenders warning. The first shells told them to take cover. The later waves hit empty holes. But taut didn't warn. It didn't build up. It arrived. Every man, gun, and bunker was hit before any could react. The Germans discovered that their concrete didn't matter if they had no time to enter it. Entire strongpoints that had survived weeks of shelling collapsed in under a minute. Command posts vanished. Ammunition bunkers detonated in perfect unison. Anti-aircraft crews died beside still-warm barrels. In the archives of the Wehrmacht's artillery school at Jüterbog, captured after the war, one analyst wrote bitterly, "The enemy has eliminated duration. There is no longer warning, only conclusion." The American artillery ascendancy for the Americans. Time on target became a symbol of identity, a quiet confidence that their army no longer fought through brute force, but through synchronization. Every level of command could now act as part of a single organism. A private loading a 105 mm shell near Cologne might not know it, but his actions were synchronized to dozens of other men miles away, each following the same ticking sequence. It was the first glimpse of what modern militaries would later call networked warfare, separate units, functioning through shared data and shared time. Generals like Omar Bradley and Matthew Ridgway credited the system with saving thousands of infantry lives. In reports to Washington, Bradley wrote, "Our artillery has become instantaneous. The enemy receives no notice, only the result." Field manuals printed in 1945 began including time on target as standard procedure. It was no longer experimental. It was the foundation of American fire doctrine. The engineers of silence. After the war, much of the credit went to the unsung mathematicians and officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the men who had devised the technique years earlier. They were not frontline soldiers. They were physicists, professors, and technicians who had transformed gunnery from guesswork into applied science. Their tools were simple: slide rules, range tables, and synchronized watches. But their concept, that all elements of a battle could be united through precise timing, was revolutionary. It foreshadowed the same logic that would later power ballistic missiles, radar interception, and even modern computer networks. They had taken the chaos of the battlefield and gridded it into seconds, and by doing so, they had changed warfare more profoundly than any new weapon could. The German response. Too late captured documents from 1945 show that the Germans tried, desperately, to replicate what they had faced. Orders went out from the OKH, Army High Command, to develop a gleichzeitiges Feuern, simultaneous firing system using synchronized telephones. But their infrastructure was shattered, their communications unreliable, their radios jamming or captured. Without secure timing or centralized coordination, the idea remained theoretical. A surviving note from a German artillery instructor reads, We understand the principle, but not the method. The Americans think in minutes. We think in orders. That single sentence captured the difference. The Wehrmacht operated by hierarchy. The Americans, through synchronization, operated by consensus of clocks. It was democracy turned into fire control. Hundreds of small units acting together without waiting for permission. The unseen psychological war, for those who fought, time on target had also changed the psychology of survival. War had always been about anticipation, the tension between knowing an attack was coming and not knowing when. TOT removed that tension. There was no anticipation, no warning, no build-up. Only the instant. For German soldiers it bred paralysis. For American troops it inspired a strange calm, a faith in the invisible precision of their own side. When the clock struck 0, one gunner later said, we knew everything ahead of us was gone. It wasn't pride. It was relief. That invisible synchronization became a moral anchor amid the chaos. In a world collapsing into smoke, a ticking watch meant order. By April 1945, as American guns rolled across the Rhine, the enemy's ability to defend itself with artillery was gone. The German batteries that once filled the sky with steel were now silent holes in the ground. And every soldier in Europe, friend or foe, understood why. It wasn't just superior guns or more shells. It was because the Americans had learned to aim time. The invention that never stopped firing. From the battle clock to the digital age. When the war ended, and the thunder of guns was replaced by the ticking of reconstruction, the world slowly realized that time on target was more than a battlefield trick. It was a glimpse into the future. A future where precision would matter more than mass, and where seconds would decide wars instead of divisions. In the months following Germany's surrender, U.S. officers at Fort Sill and the Army War College began compiling data from the European campaign. Their conclusions were startling. Artillery had not only caused the majority of German battlefield casualties, it had done so with unprecedented efficiency. The mathematics behind time on target proved something profound, that coordination and communication could multiply firepower more effectively than additional guns. In their final report, the Artillery Command wrote, "Fire superiority is no longer a question of range or caliber, but of synchronization." The idea rippled outward through the newly forming post-war world. In 1949, as NATO emerged from the ashes of Europe, its first operational doctrine borrowed directly from the Fort Sill manuals. Unified timing became the cornerstone of Allied command. Every radio network, every radar screen, every early warning center operated on the same synchronized clock, Greenwich Mean Time, zeroed by atomic precision. From Normandy's muddy fields to the control rooms of Cold War bunkers, time on target had evolved into time on warning, the global discipline of reaction measured in seconds. The electronic inheritance, the EZ2, to men who had once calculated trajectories with pencils and slide rules became the mentors of the computer age. Their obsession with precise timing inspired the first generation of digital fire control systems. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Los Alamos, engineers used the same principles to program early mainframe computers. Input variables, synchronize outputs, achieve simultaneity. The ballistic calculators that coordinated guns in 1944 became the intellectual ancestors of ENIAC, the world's first general-purpose electronic computer, originally designed for artillery tables. From ENIAC would come everything from missile guidance to spaceflight navigation. The chain of logic was unbroken. The second a shell left a barrel near Aachen in 1944, a line was drawn forward to a digital clock counting down at Cape Canaveral in 1969. Time on target had taught humanity to think of technology not as individual machines, but as systems moving in perfect rhythm. NATO and the rhythm of the Cold War, as the Cold War began, the concept of synchronized timing became the heartbeat of Western defense. American and British artillery schools trained their NATO allies in TOT principles, but now the guns were replaced by missile batteries, and the flight times were measured in minutes instead of seconds. The same doctrine that once directed 150 mm shells now coordinated nuclear readiness. If deterrence was to work, every system, radar, bomber, submarine, satellite, had to strike on time every time. In classified NATO manuals from the 1950s, diagrams labeled simultaneous release and convergent impact were direct descendants of time on target. The difference was scale. The synchronization that once annihilated a ridge outside Aachen now governed the balance of the entire planet. The Fire Direction Center, that small tent filled with pencils and radios, had evolved into something vast, the Command Information Center, or CIC. Its heartbeat was no longer a stopwatch but a glowing radar screen. Its purpose was the same, to unite distance through time. By the Vietnam War, artillery officers could coordinate TOT strikes using computers that calculated flight paths in milliseconds. By Desert Storm, those calculations had migrated to satellites, synchronizing every tank, aircraft, and missile under one digital clock. The precision, once achieved by watch synchronization, was now guaranteed by GPS timing, signals, direct descendants of the discipline, learned in those muddy forests of 1944. Every time your phone pings a satellite or your laptop adjusts its clock to coordinated universal time, it is echoing the same principle that once leveled German flak batteries in 30 seconds. The moral echo. Even decades later, many veterans spoke uneasily of time on target. They admired its brilliance, but some feared what it had set in motion. A world that paradox became the shadow of modern warfare. The efficiency of synchronization, first celebrated for saving lives, also made killing effortless. The same discipline that once united men under watches would one day unite machines under algorithms. A legacy measured in seconds by the 21st century, the language of time on target had been absorbed into everything, from precision-guided munitions to network synchronization protocols. Its descendants carry names like Joint Time-Sensitive Targeting and Coordinated Effects Delivery. The weapons have changed, but the heartbeat remains. Simultaneous impact, minimal warning, maximum effect. Even peacekeeping operations and disaster relief rely on the same timing architecture. Aircraft drops, satellite coordination, global logistics, all synchronized to the second. When the U.S. Navy launched Tomahawk cruise missiles during Operation Desert Storm, their arrival times were coordinated so precisely that explosions struck across Baghdad within a 3-second window. It was time on target reborn, this time on a planetary scale. The quiet inheritance. And yet, amid all the data and digital glow, the origins remain humble. Men in muddy boots, hunched over radios in the Ardennes, synchronizing watches by flashlight. They could not have known that their discipline, the insistence that every second mattered, would one day bind satellites, networks, and nations. In a very real sense, the war's greatest invention was not a weapon at all. It was a way of thinking about time, as something you could aim, fire, and deliver. By the end of 1945, the world was no longer